Breaking news. The Russian wave of re-nationalization will sweep over everyone. Hello. Presented by The Bell, here is Alexandra Prokopenko with your weekly economic update on the Russian economy. This time, we look at how Russia is slowly reversing the effects of privatizations implemented after the fall of the Soviet Union. Some of the victims include former officials and oligarchs who were once loyal to the Kremlin. This week, President Vladimir Putin had to defend the move, arguing that it did not violate his earlier promises to let sleeping dogs lie. There is, however, little room for doubt that the president is being dishonest once again. The phrase, "it's different, you don't understand," Putin said at this week's Vladivostok Economic Forum. No deprivatization is going to happen, I can assure you of that. However, we are already in the double digits for re-nationalizations. This year alone, 17 lawsuits have been filed by prosecutors seeking to have businesses seized by the state, according to Ilya Shumanov, former director of Transparency International in Russia. Assets that were privatized more than 30 years ago have been at the center of several of these lawsuits. Earlier this month, for example, the state took over 94.2% of Metafrix Chemicals, a methane producer. The company's privatization in 1992 was ruled invalid by a court. Dmitry Rybolovlev, a future billionaire, acquired the company through a series of deals in the 1990s. Until this month, Rybolovlev's former business partner, Saifeddin Rustamov, owned Metafrix. The original privatization of Metafrix was done without a government decision, the prosecution argued in case materials, and was a violation of the economic sovereignty of the Russian Federation and its defense capability. This was a major justification for the nationalization. The choice of words is crucial. In the 1990s, state property was managed and disposed of at the regional level, not the federal level, so this raises questions about the competence of regional authorities involved in arranging privatizations. As a result, many of the deals made during that time could be challenged in court. In January, Putin emphasized the importance of bringing strategic businesses back under state control. By the summer, the inventory of seized property was complete. Boris Mintz, a former colleague of Russia's 1990s privatization czar, Anatoly Chubais, who fled Russia following the country's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, had assets seized, as had former officials Andrei Korovenko and Oleg Sorokin and Western companies. Also having his wealth frozen was Russia's richest man, Andrei Melnichenko. Melnichenko bought the Sabeco Energy Company from ex-minister Mikhail Abizov in 2018 for 31.8 billion rubles, around $500 million. The Prosecutor General's office has now demanded that the company be seized. Abizov was arrested for corruption less than a year later. The Prosecutor General's office now suspects corruption in the Sabeco transaction. Any significant industry in Russia can be considered strategic. Prosecutors, however, are keen on energy, fertilizers, transportation, and logistics businesses because of their potential for export revenue. Recently we have seen increasing state interest in port infrastructure. Alexander Shokin, head of the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, told RBC earlier this month. The Prosecutor General's office is doing a lot of work in the area, and the government is reclaiming some logistics assets that were privatized in error in the 1990s. This year has seen the nationalization of the Far Eastern Shipping Company and 92.4% of its shares, as well as the nationalization of the ports of Perm, Kaliningrad, and Murmansk. Defend yourself, if necessary. One Russian tycoon told The Bell, "The message from the state is clear: you own nothing." He warned that the state's extremely unpredictable behavior makes it difficult to know which of your actions will draw scrutiny and result in the seizure of your possessions. Everyone is feeling under pressure, another executive said. It's crucial that you make the right connections with influential people, and have that good deed reflected on you. However, another prominent businessman disagrees that deprivatization will grow into a major new practice. Saying, "I don't completely understand why the Prosecutor General's office is suddenly acting like this." However, some of the renationalized resources had already been abandoned or were on their last legs. It's not clear who stands to gain from this. He cited the state's acquisition of Far East Shipping Company stock in January as an illustration. Ziauddin Magomedov, a billionaire who was once close to ex-president Dmitry Medvedev, owned the Fesco Transport Group, of which this company was a part. Magomedov was already serving a 19-year sentence for leading a criminal organization and fraud when he was transferred a month earlier. His older sibling spent 18 years behind bars. One of the Bell's sources thinks that since the invasion of Ukraine, there has been a heightened risk to the assets of foreigners and tycoons who have fled the country. Another businessman warned that the government could target companies whose owners did not demonstrate sufficient support for Russia's war in Ukraine. He claims that regional authorities regularly report company war efforts to the Kremlin. You can try not to give the governor the delivery of body armor he wanted, but the next day they'll be on the phone asking questions, he warned. One businessman told the Bell that Melnichenko, a billionaire, could be in danger after hearing that anti-war tycoon Oleg Tinkov said in an interview that Melnichenko actually hates Putin. Melnichenko refutes this assertion. For a while, it was believed that Western sanctions provided some protection against state seizures, with some even suggesting that businessmen who fell victim to sanctions might be compensated by the Kremlin. That's very honorable, Shokin remarked. But now virtually everyone is subject to punishment. In order to keep your company afloat, it is no longer sufficient to pretend the war does not exist. Instead, you should make it clear that you back the war in Ukraine. But this isn't just about getting even or trying to drum up support. There also seems to be practical considerations. The businessman who thinks deprivatization won't affect the whole economy has noticed that the Kremlin has been increasing its oversight of exports, particularly of raw materials. That's why people are suddenly thinking about ports and logistics, he explained. Bloomberg reported earlier this month that billionaire Dmitry Mazepin's proposal to form a solitary fertilizer exporter was being considered by the state. He told the Bell that metals and grains were being considered for a similar plan. What's going on, anyway? Putin has admitted in the past that Russia's privatization in the 90s was unjust, but he has also promised that nothing will be done to change the policy. This has been crucial to his success in the business world. For instance, in 2011, Putin warned, this type of re-nationalization could lead to worse consequences than the original dishonest privatization. It could disrupt the work of large enterprises. The invasion of Ukraine, however, has shown that there are holes in this sort of unofficial agreement. After the initial shock of the war subsided, some businessmen began to suggest they were successful despite Putin's and the Kremlin's lack of involvement. To paraphrase, I made it on my own in the business world. There is still a widespread belief in the West that Putin and his inner circle control all policy decisions in Russia, a country of 146 million people, and that obtaining political favor is essential to running a successful business. Melnichenko, Russia's wealthiest person, stated as much in another recent interview. As to why the rest of the world should care, as recent renationalizations have shown, no one is truly safe any longer. Traditional safety nets, such as Western sanctions or influential friends, are ineffective. Both the non-Russian and the Russian owners need to make plans for an exit. The Kremlin is desperate to maintain the loyalty of the military, intelligence agencies, and influential regional leaders despite a decline in revenue. The new Russian elite will make decisions that will affect its wealth and social standing. Sometimes, Indian funds get stuck in Russia. Due to restrictions on the withdrawal of dividends by foreigners, nearly $600 million in dividend income from Indian oil companies is stuck in Russia. Indian Oil Corporation, Bharat Petroleum Corporation, Oil India, and ONGC Videsh are four major Indian firms that have been unable to bring home their earnings. Money from Russia is also stuck in India. Although precise estimates are difficult to come by, some have put the number at around $10 billion. A massive trade deficit is to blame for this situation. Reuters reported in July that Indian oil refineries were making payments in Chinese yuan for Russian oil. Major players, the rate of inflation in Russia increased to 0.13% between September 5 and 11. On Friday, the central bank raised its key interest rate by 100 basis points, bringing the new rate to 13% and marking the third increase in the cost of borrowing in as many months. Inflation projections for 2023 were also increased by the bank, from 5.5 to 7% to 6.7 to 7%, and lending growth projections were increased from 13.1 to 17.0% to 14.1 to 18.0%. The report also anticipated that the average key interest rate in 2023 would be 9.6% to 9.7%. On Tuesday, the Ministry of Economic Development released a revised three-year macro forecast. The most likely scenario predicts that by 2026, the average exchange rate for the dollar will have risen to 92.3 rubles from its 2022 average of 85.2 rubles.